So our panel today asks a very important question. How can Africa's startups become scale-ups, and why does it actually matter? Across the continent, SMEs aren't simply side stories. They are the backbone of our economies, creating scales of jobs and driving innovation. In the energy sector, SMEs deliver last-mile power, they build vital logistics, and they strengthen local content in oil, gas, and renewables. Despite these important contributions, barriers keep coming up time and time again. A lack of affordable finance, regulatory uncertainty, and difficulty scaling across our borders. These issues hold back growth and limit Africa's ability to seize new energy opportunities. The good news, and the reason we are here today, is that there are, in fact, solutions. We have blended finance models that help us reduce risk, and the African Continental Free Trade Agreement helps us open regional markets. And across the continent, we are seeing proof that when SMEs are empowered, they deliver innovation, resilience, and crucially, inclusive growth. Today, we will focus on what works, look at what some of the issues are, and hopefully leave with concrete examples and recommendations to help SMEs truly become Africa's game changers. So I'll very briefly introduce all of our panelists in one go, and then we'll jump straight into our conversation to make sure that we save on time. We are joined on our panel by Natznet Tesfay, who is the Vice President of Global Insight at S&P Global Market Intelligence. Natznet is an expert in geopolitical risk and emerging market resilience, advising corporates and governments on strategy and investment. We are also joined by Erika Achum, who's the CEO of VivaJets. Erika is an entrepreneur driving connectivity solutions through business aviation, focused on overcoming those regulatory barriers and advancing intra-African mobility. James White joins us as the CEO of Comet Energy, and he is an energy executive with nearly 2 decades of leadership experience focused on renewable and conventional projects to accelerate Africa's energy transition. And last but certainly not least, we are joined by Shawn, the acting CEO of the Northern Cape Economic Development, Trade and Investment Promotion Agency. That's a mouthful. Shawn is a public sector leader with 15 years of experience in PPPs and infrastructure development, driving industrial corridor and green hydrogen projects in South Africa's Northern Cape. If we can give our whole panel a round of applause to welcome them. Thank you so much. So Natznet, I'll start with you, if you don't mind. Given your knowledge and your ability to speak to market intelligence, and I know we're speaking about market intelligence today, you're not here to speak about ratings, just for clarity. But if you could give us a grounding for this conversation, looking at not only the macro trends, but also some of the on-the-ground information that you're seeing. What is the world that SMEs are navigating today? And how will shifts in our global environment affect their resilience going forward?
Thank you, Ndapwa. I think, pointedly, I would start with the fact that the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act is expiring today.
Yes.
And I think that is it speaks to the global environment that we're operating in, and one that we've seen evolving or unraveling since late last year. So this puts, I'll come back to what this means for Africa, but this puts the global environment in a period of heightened and sometimes unprecedented uncertainty in areas where we've seen long-standing multi-decade conventions being upended for one reason or another, in a steady march towards more insularly focused governance and policies. We've seen that in the decline of ODA, overseas development assistance to emerging and frontier markets, Africa being impacted. Governments unable to balance the fiscal pressures. We've seen governments in France. How many prime ministers have we had in France in the last year? Due to the budget. We've seen a German government collapse. You see the US shifting its fiscal policy with an emphasis on trade protectionism that is causing volatility, at least initially in the financial markets. But certainly it's going to have an impact on the overall growth outlook, considering its position in global trade, but specifically the influence of the US consumer. So what does that mean? On an aggregate scale, we see that global growth is moderating, but still going to grow. There are some impacts that we're waiting to see play out in its entirety, which is what you would see as the whipsawing, the front-loading, as there was uncertainty as to what tariffs and when would likely impact which countries, which commodities and products. So we're still very much feeling our way through the dark on that. You start to see that other countries, I was highlighting domestic pressures, so as not to overlook those, that are creating a more difficult environment for policymakers to set consistent and what economists would consider fiscally prudent policies. With that in mind, you're also in a period where inflation is tempering, but still sticky in some places. So the scope to ease monetary policy, which has been on a tightening bias for several years now, is limited. So global financing conditions are going to be difficult. How do investors respond? Safe haven assets, known bets. They're not going to be as adventurous as they would be in previous years. And so that means a region that has a high risk perception, like Africa, and there could be a whole debate as to what informs that, is not necessarily going to be in an advantageous position. So that's a global environment that the continent and the 54 countries are operating in. But what's happening within Africa, right? Well, let's acknowledge the agency that comes together with the unity of the 54 countries. That agency has come through with the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, opening up opportunities for scalability for SMEs. And so on the one hand, when I look at the collapse of AGOA, I look at the momentum building with AFCFTA. I look at the ability of the continent to negotiate a zero tariff agreement with China. I look at the continent re-engaging with a former colonial power, UK, on different terms because the leverage is different. This is an environment where leverage is being negotiated at each point and around each issue. Asymmetries are shifting. So Africa is no longer in a disadvantaged position if it can negotiate appropriately and with scale. So as a continent or as sub-regions, and we've seen that steady march in the formation of the ECA, SADC, ECOWAS, and thereafter, so on and so forth. In continuing to do so, there's so-called power in numbers. So that's what's happening at a global perspective, how it trickles through and affects the environment that the continent's operating in. Looking within the continent, what could potentially happen if we start to see more traction around the momentum built for regionalization. And then you start to see that SMEs can think about a market that's much larger than they'd anticipated. The opportunities to scale for any of the ideas going from pilot to platform, as the introduction said, are more abundant when thinking about it on that perspective. And diversification is going to be one of the cornerstones of resilience in this uncertain environment.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Natznet. That's a really rich grounding for the conversation. And I think it's really pertinent that you say that, you know, as much as we speak about investors being concerned about risk and uncertainty, you know, African SMEs, African operators are also, as you say, kind of feeling their way through the dark. Nobody's really quite sure when things change, how that's going to impact them and how that's going to affect them. So trying to prepare our SMEs for that is going to be really, really crucial as we go forward. I'd like to pivot to Erika and ask, you know, as we speak about these shifts that we're hoping to see, from your perspective as an operator, what are the regulatory or financing shifts that would most accelerate SME connectivity and scale across African markets, given how important it's going to be for us to work across borders together?
Thank you, Ndapwa. Before we speak about the money and financials, I'd like to speak to the policy first. Before products move, people move. And interesting what Natznet said about the AFTCA. In aviation, we have a subsect of the AFTCA called the Single African Air Transport Markets, which is still in development. I mean, the idea is to unify the African continent into one state and, you know, propel movement of Africans across Africa. However, the implementation seems to be quite, you know, deficient. It is easier for me as a Nigerian or a Nigerian registered aircraft to operate into London than it is for me to operate into Accra, which is even in the same, you know, economic zone as Nigeria, right? Bringing that even down to the people, you might be surprised that my brother here, James, might be able to access more African countries, you know, coming from Ireland than me holding a Nigerian passport. So beyond the conversation around, you know, de-risking the investments, de-risking the you know, the funding for SMEs, on the policy side, we have to be serious about, connecting Africa, a more unified Africa, because there is no way products can move if people cannot move around. On the funding side, my country, Nigeria, today we are experiencing interest rates as high as 32%, right? And there's almost no business that can have enough margins, to pay off a loan of 32%. So it's something we have to really think about. We have to start to see patient capital come into the country, whether it's by means of coming to the continent, whether it's by means of venture capital, or governments more or less de-risking this capital for SMEs. And then finally, what's the classification of an SME, right? How do we ensure that we are able to target industries with very high growth potential and ensure that these funds flow directly into these industries? On the policy side, we have to bring down the barriers to entry, and I mean, when you put all of that together, we can start to talk about the Africa that we all envision.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Erika. And it really is pertinent to think that, people do move before products. So until we are able to see an Africa where being African actually has meaning in terms of where our passport can allow us to access within the continent, then it's going to be very difficult to talk about that intra-regional trade and scaling up. James, from your experience, where do you think blended finance models play a role, and how can they be strengthened to support SMEs? And maybe if you could also give us some insight into where we've seen actually accelerated growth for SMEs in terms of the finance models they're able to access.
Okay. Well, I think to start, SMEs are so crucial to innovation in Africa. They're usually the first movers on most development projects. So we were involved in both oil and gas and renewable projects. And what you'll see is that in many scenarios, it's the little SME company that's foreseen the opportunity because they are more innovative, because they are more agile, because they've got more access to the local and regional markets. They see an opportunity and they go for it. However, it becomes difficult then to access finance for an early stage development. And it doesn't matter if it's oil or gas or renewable. Before you can get to a bankable project, getting access to capital is very, very difficult. So whilst you're trying to lay the groundwork for a bigger company to come in and help bring on your project, you need access to that capital, and the traditional banks won't give it to you. And it doesn't matter if it's an African bank or a European bank or an American bank. Until you've got something that you can bank, they're not going to give you that equity. Blended finance models do offer that, and they can be really good to get that early capital into a project, to do your feasibility studies from a development point of view, where you can do those, get your permits, get your licenses, and work up the area from a technical and economic perspective to bring in a bigger partner. Now, where blended financial models become difficult is that they're often quite complex to structure, and you're reliant on the donor institution, the governments that you're dealing with, the regional governments that you're dealing with, and then you as the developer. And many times, and many occasions, those timelines don't overlap. For instance, just from our own perspective in Comet, we went through a very arduous application process to get blended finance. We were accepted for it. We then are reliant on both regional and national governments to give us letters of support for the project. They then have to go through their own processes internally. That then drags on, and it doesn't match what the institution's timeline was. So then you can lose the funding because it's not, in sync with everything else. So, blended finance is a great way to get early access to capital, but it's not without its own risk.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think that's something that's been coming out throughout the first day of the conference, is that those bureaucratic barriers are really becoming a huge, huge issue. And especially as we're seeing so many countries and so many organizations needing to pivot in this changing geopolitical landscape, needing to pivot, needing to build those new relationships, but struggling because of the sort of decentralized nature of deal making that we're working with. As a cross-cutting question, maybe for the whole panel, and maybe something that you could illustrate with an example or something practical that you might have come across in your work, what do you anticipate Africa's energy sector would look like in the next, or Africa's SME landscape in the energy sector will look like in the next 5 years if current trends continue? And do you see any spaces or any examples of changes that could take us off that trajectory or keep us on that trajectory if it's a good one? What are we looking for? What are we looking towards in the next 5 years or so? Whoever would like to take that first. Shawn, I see you making eye contact with me.
No, thank you so much. I think, I'm not sure if the mic is going through. No, I think from our perspective, I think inward looking from a Northern Cape sort of scenario, the idea is that we move and progress with everyone in terms of the energy mix. Obviously from a South Africa perspective, we're hoping for a diversified sort of scenario. And within the next 5 years, there's going to be elements where you'll need to ensure that there's a proper understanding how that looks and feels like, and ultimately integrate and ensure that localization happens in key areas where the energy is being produced. It doesn't matter what type of energy it is. So an appreciation of the landscape, and obviously from a Northern Cape perspective, where the advent of renewable energy since 2010 in South Africa, we've been able to sort of aggregate about 60% of the renewable energy component, and we've been really hoping to change the tide of having to sort of inwardly not localize some of the key components and make sure that SMEs are part and parcel of the trajectory in terms of aggregating that energy and making sure that they also appreciate key value chain opportunities, because that's how you actually introduce them into the ecosystem. So with a diversified sort of trajectory, if you like, looking at various components, as you would know, in South Africa, we have elements where in relation to transmission infrastructure, 14,000 kilometers needs to be closed off. And that is going to be part and parcel of how do we integrate sort of SMEs participating in the broader value chain from a horizontal as well as a vertical integrated perspective. And I believe we have an opportunity to ensure, whether it's in the Northern Cape or in Mpumalanga or in the Eastern Cape or even Western Cape, how do we diversify and integrate everyone and make sure that they are part of the just sort of process in ensuring energy security, as it were.
And before I pivot to the rest of the panel, Shawn, I actually would like to get some further insight from you, because given your oversight of the hydrogen corridor and provincial development in the Northern Cape, you talk about making sure that SMEs have entry into the infrastructure value chain, but how do we de-risk that? How do we make sure that that is not just another instance where an SME is placed into a position and not necessarily given that support or being walked through that process to make sure that it's not risky?
No, 100%. Thank you so much for that. I think maybe just to sketch the scenario again, inwardly looking, and the industrial corridor obviously in the context of the Northern Cape. The Northern Cape is one of those very big provinces since the advent of the current democratic dispensation. So post-1994, the province was birthed. And we've been known to be remote, sparse distributed in terms of populace, only about 1.4 million people currently residing, but very resource rich and under-industrialized. So I stand here today to try and reaffirm that we are reframing that particular narrative and ensuring that we are no longer that peripheral province. We see ourselves as a province that is going to be South Africa's new growth frontier in relation to industrialization, also obviously leveraging on the green energy potential, and this is something that needs to converge with community development, as it were. But we need to be clear in terms of how we're going to realize that. Our province is looking at about 5 catalytic projects, if you like, but it's not a standalone scenario that we're seeing sort of unfold. We need to make sure that we integrate SMEs, because like James, who I called Mark earlier, indicated that they are the innovators and young entrepreneurs that really sort of drive the mechanics in relation to our economic sort of trajectory, as it were. And they become those new starters or players that create sort of new pathways in relation to how we're going to really become the beating heart of transformation as a journey in terms of our decarbonization or even energy security sort of landscape. So from a province perspective, one of the key things that we're looking at is really leveraging of our natural endowments, ensuring that everyone really understands how that looks and feels like. We relatively resource rich in relation to mining throughput. So we've got critical rare earth minerals, we've got the vast landscape. I mentioned we're about the size of Germany as a province. So it's relatively large, and with that, it presents really a relative opportunity for us to see how do we drive that inclusive growth, which includes big players as well as those entry sort of entrepreneurs, if you like, or SMEs, and ensuring that they become part and parcel of the journey. But in order to be able to sort of bridge that divide, there are three sort of key areas or barriers that I believe we need to speak to, not only from a Northern Cape perspective, but also from an Africa perspective, ensuring that there's accessibility in terms of affordable funding and appropriate funding for the type of initiatives and innovative disruptors that SMEs are usually sort of coming through as. How do we integrate them into our global and regional value chains and ensure that there's policy and regulatory environments that are not too aspirational in this instance, but become something that is operational, that can be implemented. So for us, what becomes key is how do we make sure that these three elements that you've mentioned, as it were, become something that is meaningful to de-risk sort of that particular entry into the infrastructure value chain, particularly around water finance as well as the local content sort of scenario. For us, for instance, on the question of water, water is a key throughput in relation to a hydrogen economy, if you like, or even industrialization, because those are usually very thirsty type of industries, and we need to make sure that we integrate and find ways that are strategically not going to constrain the development envelope. And institutions like the one that I'm currently heading is ensuring that we look at how do we best structure sort of pathways for SMEs to be able to penetrate particular value chains, specifically in the water segment as well as energy segment. And I also wanted to mention that, for instance, a province like the Northern Cape is sitting with about 330 kilometers of coastline. So desalination naturally becomes sort of a solution option that we need to consider. And we want to utilize that as a pivot in terms of hydrogen production, industrialization, agro-processing, and ensuring that we are able to sort of catalyze development. And in this, we'll look at the circular economic opportunities in terms of how that can be driven. But secondly, it's the issue around financing and breaking sort of that barrier in terms of how traditional banking models see SMEs to be very risky or they're very risk averse. Our role is to look at how best do we then integrate sort of blended finance scenarios, looking at various instruments that are available. So on our part, we summarily serve as that bridge, if you like, that ensures that SMEs are able to start sort of gaining access to instruments that your DTIC will have in place, your DBSA, and the like. And ensuring, thirdly, that we're not focused only on mega projects as a key input, as it were. We want to make sure that we create that circular economic opportunity again. And key for us is that from a province that has been birthed in 1994, for the longest time, we've been a province that has been an extraction point. And now how do we change that? Is to ensure that we start diversifying and really industrializing and value add sort of scenario which creates opportunities for the horizontals again and vertical integrated opportunities for circular economic sort of pivots, as it were. So this is something that could then open up for startups as well as SMEs to be able to infiltrate sort of that particular segment, but it diversifies in terms of the economic drivers that really change that socio-economic landscape of areas that we sort of traverse.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thanks, Shawn. Definitely the idea of moving from extraction points to actual areas of value addition, of diversification is going to be huge, not just in the Northern Cape and not just in South Africa, but across the continent. If I can come back to our other panelists and get some insights into my previous question about what we kind of anticipate in the next 5 years or so in terms of our trajectory for the SME landscape in Africa's energy sector. What are we looking out for? What should we be aware of, whether we are SMEs ourselves or we work with them? I don't know who would like to go first. James, I see you making
well, I suppose just from an energy development perspective, there's an energy transition going on, and one of the things that has happened, particularly been driven by Trump coming in America, is pro-oil and gas again, as opposed to this drive to be a green economy. So I think in the next 5 years, there's going to be a little bit of a step back from the drive to pure renewables as there was. And it's going to be a bit of more of a transition, as the name suggests, between oil and gas and renewables. And, from a financial perspective, this is from my own experience. Now, renewable projects is probably easier to get finance for, but the returns for an investor are much less. So attracting the equity investor is more difficult. For oil and gas projects, you can get an equity investor much more easier than renewable, but then getting the debt equity or the debt finance from a bank becomes difficult because you have to fulfill their ESG requirements. So, it's a pretty interesting point to be at this next few years during this transition, and also geopolitically with what's going on. So I can't give you a straight answer.
If I could jump in.
Natznet, yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, just briefly, adding on to what the two gentlemen have said, which was very comprehensive in those two areas, in terms of a permissive regulatory environment and navigating the different financial instruments, which I can go off on a tangent on, but I'll prevent myself from doing so. You spoke about it in the prep session. Maybe if we have time. I just think about the opportunities that are afforded with the rest of the world catching up to the fact that it's an energy transition for continents where you have such prevalent energy poverty. It's an energy addition. It's an impediment to growth. It's an impediment to industrialization. It's an impediment to income distribution within the continent. So, in accepting the reality on the ground here, you're accepting that there's going to be a wider scope of latitude to address all of those needs at once. So what is the role of SMEs in that environment? Well, if you're taking an all-of-the-above approach, I'm thinking about it as SMEs as consumers. We saw that last year, if you look at the World Investment Report, the sharpest increase in investment flows to Africa was in renewable sectors. So that's going to open up access in terms of like a wider geographical spread. So you're going to have the ability for smaller startups, pilots wherever they may be in tier 2 or 3 cities, being able to scale even if incrementally. And that affords an ability for more regional economic development rather than concentrated, as we find in many developed markets around capital cities or a handful of cities. You then see that there's a greater aptitude, there's been this appetite as we move to renewables for the feedstock into that, so the critical minerals. And African governments understanding that there is new ways to approach greater localization around that for beneficiation and value addition, which SMEs will feed into if given a permissive environment, or indeed given some type of incentives to allow them to de-risk. Multilaterals playing a role within that, like Africa Exim. And now this renewed interest, or this slight respite on the dampener on upstream oil and gas, and recognizing that there are opportunities there, and looking at being able to refine within the continent. So we've spoken about Dangote and how that's not just shifted the downstream market within the continent, but globally. But then additionally, the wider use cases of gas and the monetization potential there. So it opens up a wide array of potential opportunities for SMEs, which are resourceful, quite innovative, on the cutting edge, to be involved in that. And we'll start to see examples, I'm sure, emerge and surface of really enterprising African SMEs setting a standard that will be replicated elsewhere, because we've seen that in the way that Kenya has deployed mobile money when no one else was looking at that as even a reality, let alone seeing the SME financing opportunities that came out of that. I think more of that is on the horizon, if I want to be the optimist on the panel, considering I started with a fairly dour global outlook.
Duality, thank you. No, we appreciate that. Erika, from your side, what are you anticipating or seeing in terms of, I think it would be helpful if you could look at the what's the word I'm looking for, boundary relationships, or the way that we're able to interact as African countries and how that's changed and how that is changing.
I mean, going back to the earlier question, and domesticating it to our industry, which is aviation, you have to look at the technology that is prevalent, right? The machine or the machinery consumes the fuel, so you have to look at the kind of technology prevalent, and in the next 5 years we would see more efficient aircraft engines, but I don't think we would see a complete change from traditional jet or propeller engines to electric engines or engines consuming sustainable aviation fuel. So there will still be a demand for Jet A1, which is a derivative of crude oil. I don't think we would see solar-powered passenger-carrying airplanes in the next 5 years. I don't think we will see hydrogen-powered passenger-carrying airplanes in the next 5 years. So it looks to us like the current energy composition would still remain the same for us in aviation, and I don't see that changing, anytime soon.
So we're not jumping. We shouldn't jump the gun as well.
Absolutely.
We should be aware that these things take time, the transitions take time, not only just because it takes time to build something that is on a strong foundation, but also, as James pointed out, and as other panelists have pointed out, that there's often these bureaucratic barriers that stop us from doing things in a timely manner and mean that the timeline between the idea and actual operation is often quite long and can be extended the more we're trying to collaborate across borders. I'd like to take a little time to maybe engage with our audience to see if there are any questions from our audience. I'm sure that we have lots of people at the conference who either are SMEs or engage with SMEs or represent SMEs. So if there are any questions from the audience, it would be great to hear from you. I think we have some roving mics, if so. But while we wait to see if inspiration strikes for anyone, I know it is late in the day, but maybe I can ask the panel in terms of a practical takeaway, because I think that's often something that people really want to hear when we're sitting at a panel with so many years of expertise and such deep and rich understanding. If you were advising a young entrepreneur starting an SME in the energy sector today, whether it was in whatever your field of expertise or interest might be, so whether it's aviation or the renewable side or infrastructure, or even understanding global insights and geopolitics and how to utilize that information, what kind of advice what's the top piece of advice you would give somebody trying to start a business, just based on your experience as an operator in the space of African energy? Erika, I'll start with you because you're closest to me.
So I would say learn first about the business, stay connected to trends, because it's now a global environment. Something happening in the United States could easily be a factor in your production in Nigeria or Sierra Leone. The world is changing, but the world is remaining more connected than ever. And for me, I think one learning point would be to ensure that we utilize resources as simple as the internet, and keep that connection to the industry. Learning is not a one-time thing; it is continuous, and this way, it enables you to be much more prepared to face whatever challenge that comes across your way. It is easy to do business plans, it's easy to build models, but as we all know, getting into it, you face challenges that you could never, more or less provision or prepare for. So staying connected is key for me, and having a continuous learning mindset, building a resilient learning organization would be my advice.
Awesome, thank you. I saw Natznet, was that your hand?
Yeah, I was going to jump in there, quite eager. No, just building off of, I think, Erika's point on learning. Learning, especially because we see a secular trend of technology developing at a pace that we haven't seen in decades and maybe centuries, and the impact is going to be more pronounced more quickly. So understanding that when you have a partner, you know, the amount of investment that's coming into renewable technology, how are you ensuring that there's some type of transfer of knowledge there so that you can start to become maybe more vertically integrated and find opportunities for expansion there? When we talk about the financing barrier and thinking about how it can be inaccessible for SMEs to secure some of the capital that they might need, how might you be able to offset that by looking at new source cryptocurrencies? We see adoption across 12 African countries being amongst the top around the world. And they do that because when we advise clients, there are concerns. We have, you know, currency devaluation risks across the continent. We have hard currency shortages across the continent. And when you think about crypto or digital currencies, that could be something that offsets or provides you a viable alternative. So really think laterally about how you might be able to use new instruments that are being innovated, using new technology to your great advantage. And finally, you know, our continent is predominantly made up of export-oriented economies that are looking at the rest of the world. We now have the CFTA, and it's slow moving. We still don't have as much interconnectivity on the continent as I would like, so I still have to transit outside before I can go back in. But we do have non-trade barriers being addressed to a certain extent. And so start thinking about your local consumer or your regional consumer, because right now production is geared towards export orientation, and global trade is being increasingly uncertain. There's greater regionalization. You can see ASEAN is more robust because they trade more amongst itself. So how could Africa take a page out of that book to understand how to build resilience as a result of that? So think about the African consumer.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, looking at our consumers as part of our community of Africans is also going to be so important. And like you say, not just being concerned about our external off-takers or our export destinations. Shawn, I see you raring to go.
Everybody's jumping into it. So I think the advice that I would impart is really making sure that SMEs understand, like I've indicated, the ecosystem around sort of the energy spectrum or the sector, looking at identifying what are the key components that will be in high demand, and how do you best leverage or align yourself with original equipment manufacturers, do a bit of research and understand how would you be able to do things a bit differently, and try to find a particular niche so that you become sort of a disruptor in this particular space. And I do always make the example that even with a simple item like a bottle of water, look at the various components that go into getting that particular product. So if you understand the ecosystem, you start really breaking it down, you'll be able to identify what is it that you want to penetrate and understand what the demand elements look like. Because if you understand the demand and supply, it makes you sort of a game changer in the space that you'll be then occupying. But the ultimate element is being able to find pathways or instruments that will enable financing, because that is always going to be a barrier. Being able to identify within the space or even the country, if you look at it from a Africa continental free trade agreement perspective, what is it that is going to be required? I mean, we're speaking about energy availability and security and the like, but there's key elements that will incrementally, you know, get us to that particular pathway. So when you speak to these young, I'm also very young, but yeah, ensure that they understand that being able to identify that particular niche is what is going to make you a disruptor in the space. Yeah.
That's the difference, the make or break. Yeah. James?
Yeah, well, just touching on what Shawn said, you know, when you're an entrepreneur or an SME, you've got all these ideas, loads of ideas isn't the problem.
Yeah.
And one thing that, you know, I wish I realized at the start was you should be talking to financial institutions quite early to see how you can work together to reduce the risk on getting these projects off the ground, rather than having all these ideas that may not go anywhere, and just understanding the processes that need to be in place, and then working with regional agencies like Shawn's, for example, and working you know, together from an early stage so that you can get these projects going, because you can't do it by yourself.
Absolutely. We go far together.
Yes.
Everybody always says.
Yeah.
I'm sure at least 10 different people have said that today, just alone. But it resonates because it's true, because this is not something that we'll be able to do on our own. We come from different areas of expertise and different sectors. But I think the more you involve yourself and engage with the energy sector, the more you realize that it truly is not just about energy, it's not just about the oil and gas, it's not just about the engineering or the drilling or even the research. It's about the financing, it's about the understanding the socioeconomic context, it's about your researchers and your academics, your civil society organizations. It's such a multifaceted journey that we have to go on together. So I think speaking about working together, not just within our countries or our sectors, but also across the continent is going to be so important. I want to make sure that we don't have any burning questions from the audience. If anyone wants to engage with any of the panelists, or if any of the points we've made here have resonated. I know it's been a long day, so I'm hoping we're planting seeds and they will start to sprout over the course of the week. I will ask our panelists to maybe leave us with one last thought each, or one last insight that kind of sums up why you see SMEs as Africa's game changers, why we should remember, if we remember anything when we leave this room, why are SMEs so important? I'll start with Shawn. Is always making such wonderful eye contact with me that I always want to start with Shawn. So Shawn, please.
Thank you so much. There's something in my eyes, I must say. Look, I think for me, as a parting shot, I really want to frame this in the most best and probable way. For us as a Northern Cape, as mentioned, we want to be positioned as a growth front for South Africa. My premier always makes the point that in the South African context, you've always had these three key areas that have been sort of in a diamond shape development sort of pathway and trajectory, or it's been part of our sort of nexus of economic sort of emancipation, if you like. Gauteng, KZN, Western Cape. Now the Northern Cape is lifting its hand, and we're saying to SMMEs, come and innovate, come with new ideas. We are open to conversations. I'm here for the whole week, so you can come and speak to me and see how do we then generate sort of new pathways that would resonate with sort of the grandiose ideas that we have in terms of unlocking the new growth point for South Africa. So thank you so much for the opportunity and looking forward to that conversation.
Thanks so much, Shawn. Amazing. Natznet.
I'll pick up a point that was just made on the panel and attach it to something that I heard earlier today. It was a good reminder. But when we look at the opportunities to grow SMEs, many times you'll see it through the lens of local content and localization. The importance that the domestic banking sectors play in that. And when we look across the 54 countries, you don't have deep enough capital markets to facilitate that as much. And as James said, you need that early engagement to ensure that you're on the right track, at least the financially viable one. So while I highlighted, incremental progress on opening up trade and addressing some non-trade barriers, non-tariff barriers, we still need to see greater growth in that area. And you can see success stories like Nigeria, where you have greater local participation in the energy sector and a more vibrant SME environment because you have that domestic capital commitment. It also led to the growth of other sectors like the African Silicon Valley and around Lagos, et cetera. So that's what's going to create another engine. And then it has a crowding in effect of other financiers. So I would focus on the need for greater momentum around deepening capital markets across African countries.
Awesome. Thank you so much. James.
Yeah, I just think, from an SME perspective, just, but believe in yourself and keep going with it. It's amazing downstairs. I'm sure you're aware of Rhino Resources. They've made a massive discovery in Namibia. A few years ago, they were a one-man band, and look where they are now.
Yeah.
So, that's the type of company you need in Africa, and they're a local South African company as well. So just keep with it, but learn a bit about finance along the way.
Yeah, definitely will be very helpful. And Erika, last but not least.
Yeah, I think SMEs are really Africa's only true possibility of catching up with the rest of the world. And if we don't succeed with this next set of people coming up, then our future as a continent, could be called into question. So, it should be all SMEs.
Yeah.
That's it for me.
Short and sweet. Absolutely. I think on that note, I'll wrap up our panel and just leave our audience with this reminder that it's important that we stay connected, that we stay agile, and as our panelists have noted multiple times, that we build a good, strong foundation on continuous learning, so about various opportunities, about financing models, about potentialities in terms of different methods of finance, cryptocurrency, as Natznet was mentioning, and really just also look at the way that sharing our knowledge, sharing that knowledge that we are continuously building up is the best way for us to build connections within our countries and sectors, but also across the continent. So I will leave it at that. Thank you so much to our panel. Thank you to our audience for joining us. And let's continue to engage for the rest of the week. Thank you.